In November of 2014, IGN published a review that would eventually become the most controversial piece of gaming journalism in Pokemon, and perhaps the gaming community at large. A review of Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. But one part of the review of the game would go on to live in infamy. 7.8 out of 10. Too much water. And as we could see by the comments, people are not super thrilled with this. The girl's obviously working for Team Magma. Game would be a solid 10 out of 10 if it took place in a desert. IGN sees that problem with life's most important resource. Ha 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 ha. These memes would have had the whole group chat laughing in 2014, and they continue to live in infamy. Earlier this year, Pokemon made a tweet referencing this review. Too much water, not nearly enough, on July 1st, to which the original reviewer, Kaylee Plague, quote tweeted and just said, bro. I went back and actually read the review, and for the most part, I actually agreed with it. But it's not just my opinion. I've looked into the raw game data itself. I've run multiple analyses, and I think IGN was right. I think you can actually say, based on data, that Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire did in fact have too much water. And I'm here to prove that to you today. So, in order to best understand the points being made, let's go into the actual article. Interestingly, the author makes two distinct points with the too much water complaint. The first one is the one that I think most people think of when they hear the 7.8 out of 10 too much water meme, which is you have to navigate many bodies of water since much of the late game involves the HM surf and dive to get from place to place. Diving was really neat back in 2002 when it was new, but I found it incredibly tedious in Alpha and Omega. An obvious example of how superfluous some HMs are. So like I said, this is what most people think of when they hear this review, but I think something that kind of flew under the radar when this first came out, and even to this day, was part 2 of this argument, that Hoenn is still imbalanced type-wise, heavily favoring water. I feels like there are water Pokemon in nearly every battle. This phrase here is what sort of spawned this whole analysis in the first place. Is that true? In order to find out, we'll actually need this. This is a Nuzlocke damage calculator, or calc for short, created by my friend Kingler Champ. It has every trainer from every Pokemon game, with the trainer's Pokemon, the Pokemon's moves, EVs, IVs, nature, everything. So for example, Sydney of the Elite Four in this game, first member of the Elite Four, has an Absol. This Absol has a hasty nature, apparently, with Aerial Ace, Night Slash, Psycho Cut, and Slash. Kingler was nice enough to give us this data in spreadsheet form, so all we need to do is pull the data from here, and we'll be able to see out of all trainer battles how much involve water Pokemon. And after running the numbers in an ugly script, I found this. I took every trainer battle from Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Fire Red and Leaf Green for comparison. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, which is like our baseline games, 23% of trainers have at least one water-type Pokemon. In Ruby, that's 38.4. So even if you take out Team Aqua as a factor, there are still way more water-type trainers in Ruby and Sapphire than, at the very least, Fire Red and Leaf Green. And then 43.9% of all trainers in Pokemon Sapphire have at least one water-type. Meaning the original statement made isn't really far from the truth. Hoenn generally has a lot more water-type Pokemon in each trainer battle than an average Pokemon game. So just off the data alone, we can safely say IGN was right here. But then after digging into the trainer data further, we can actually make a stronger claim, which is that not only does Hoenn make it incredibly easy to catch water types because they're just fucking everywhere, they actually have a type advantage against the trainers in the game. What do I mean by that? So out of all the trainers in Hoenn, 23.5% have at least one Pokemon weak to water. The kicker is that only 13.7% of trainers have at least one Pokemon that resists water if you exclude water type Pokemon, which is necessary for this analysis because we're trying to make the case that this game over centralizes around water types. What that means is that you're 171% more likely to find a Hoenn trainer weak to water than a Hoenn trainer that resists it. It's not just the wild Pokemon, but even the trainers themselves that centralize the water type. And, you know, I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, but I think the general interpretation you could take here is that if you don't bring a water type Pokemon, you'll probably get beat by one, which is pretty in line with IGN's comments again. And finally, even beyond just the trainer battles, a weird discovery I found when I was researching both Ruby and Sapphire as well as the remakes was that for whatever reason, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire actually increase the frequency that you find water types on the early game routes. So I drew up this graphic right here, and the way to interpret this is, so Route 103 is the route that you battle your rival on for the first time when you get your starter Pokemon. In Ruby and Sapphire, the odds of encountering a Wingull in the wild grass is 10%. Now in the remakes, that encounter rate is effectively doubled to 20%. On Route 10, it's slightly increased from 8 to 10%, which isn't crazy, but it's just like, why would Game Freak do that? It seems like an odd choice. On Route 114, Lotad is increased from 30 to 40%. There should be a little asterisk here because Lotad is actually in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire changed to a Lombre encounter rate with 40%, but since it's the same evolution line, the decision behind this change was still clear. And then in Route 117, Meryl's encounter rate is increased from 10 to 15%. If you're asking why Game Freak did this, there is actually a rationale here. We can assume that it's maybe to help players beat the first gym, which is a rock type. So, you know, Game Freak was like, let's help these 8-year-olds beat Roxanne if they can't understand that you need water types to win, and they give you a water type that's also a flying type, so it's not super overpowered in the form of Wingull. It all just goes to further prove IGN's point about skewing towards water type Pokemon, right? Especially when they're increasing the frequency of water Pokemon at the beginning of the game where you can't buy repels. So in summary, you're even more likely to see water type Pokemon even when you're not on water routes. I didn't mention earlier, but even on the grass routes, you're more likely to run into water types. And you're more likely to run into them at the beginning of the game before you have repels. I think at this point, we could say with full confidence that IGN was at least somewhat spitting when they said that Hoenn was too water centralized. And now part 2 of her argument, water routes are tedious and boring. This is where things get a little bit more complicated because this is by nature a bit of a more subjective opinion. IGN argues that part of what makes these water routes tedious is the need for HMs. And that's going to be something we try to answer with data too. So let's talk about HMs. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, there's 7 HMs. And now technically you only need to use 5 of them because in no part of the game forces you to use cut in order to progress, like in the Kanto games where you have to cut the tree down to get into Vermilion's gym. Oras requires 7 HMs, that's cut, fly, surf, strength, waterfall, rock smash, and dive. And in the review, they compare it to XY, which only has 5 HMs, which is cut, fly, water, surf, strength, waterfall. They took out rock smash and dive. And on top of that, of the 5 HMs that you need in XY, only 2 of them are necessary to beat the game, which is insane. Technically, the number is 5 in Oras because technically you don't need fly to beat the games. But if you're not using fly in Pokemon, you're kind of a psycho. I don't trust anyone who isn't using fly. But technically, just to really be objective here, you need 5 HMs to beat Oras, whereas you only need 2 to beat XY. So going from 2 minimum HMs in XY to 5 is of course going to feel boring, and it's going to feel restrictive. The case that IGN is making about the HM superfluousness is clear if you're coming off of Pokemon XY. And it's not even just me or IGN saying this. Game Freak, I think, would agree with this, because if you picked up any Pokemon game in the last years, you know that Game Freak also doesn't think HMs are great. They've taken them entirely from the modern games. At this point, I think most people are on board with HMs. I think most people agree that HMs were restrictive. Not many people are huge fans of them nowadays. Even in ROM hacks, a lot of the time they've made like HMs a key item or something that you don't need to teach to a specific Pokemon. So I think most people can be on board for the argument that IGN makes regarding HMs. Now let's talk about water routes being boring to navigate. If there's any argument that I think is the weakest out of everything that IGN said in their review, this is probably the weakest, although I think there's still a point to be made here. So let's dig into it. The water routes were a common complaint in the original Ruby and Sapphire, and it's not hard to see why. This is the entirety of Route 127. Something you might notice upon first glance is that it's fucking huge. Like it's enormous. Like you see these brown boulders, a quarter of this brown boulder is the size of the player character. So like the player character, like Brendan or May or whatever, is about the size of my mouse. Back in Ruby and Sapphire, Game Freak really asked the player to navigate this entire body of water. It's easy to get lost because the screen is so small and the pathing isn't super clear. There's like dive spots which will like lead you to this dead end, and this random dive spot here, just a lot of excess, and it's just huge. And then on top of that, there's not even that much variation in the water tiles. So you're seeing like the same 3 or 4 tiles of like these rocks and the deep water, and then maybe some shallow water tiles here and there. There's literally 3 different water tiles, 4 if you include the shallow water tiles you could walk on, which I don't even know if that could be called a water tile at that point, since you could walk on it. The whole point is that making players cover this distance is absolutely tedious. And again, I think Game Freak would probably agree with that statement, because the remakes did try to address this problem. For one, they shrunk most of the water routes. I don't know if it gets talked about that much, but this is the same water route, Route 127. You'll have to bear with me. This is the highest quality picture I could find. But if we take kind of like a side-by-side look, it's pretty clear that it's a smaller route. For one, there's 2 entrances to this island in the original games, whereas here, it's just one. So the games are much more linear in that way. And on top of that, there's like more land tiles here. Like this is a whole beach now, whereas in the original games, this was like more like an island and kind of confusing to navigate, especially for kids. And these land tiles here sort of help break up the scenery a little bit more. The same can be said for Route 124. This is the original Route 124. Just a fuck ton of ocean. And this is the remake. Much more concise. Much more concise. Again, this is one player character. This is the size of the player character. It's still large, don't get me wrong, but they definitely made the route more narrow. Like, look at this. And then on top of that, adding more like land tiles up here versus here, which is still water. And then even on Route 128, which is where you go to wake up Kyogre or Groudon, like there's this cave that you have to dive under. It's surrounded by these water tiles or like these shallow water tiles. In the remakes, they're given their own like unique tiles to like really show the importance of them. And even though I think even here, this is probably the most similar to the old game or to this is probably the most similar route in terms of size. And then on top of all of that, I recorded a movement test between both Ruby and Sapphire and Oras. And if you put it side by side, you actually see, and you probably even felt this when you played the games, that you move much faster when using Surf and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire versus the originals. So here's the speed test between both games on Route 124, which is between Moss Deep and Lily Cove City. You can see that Oras, you can move diagonally, which helps you move faster than you would in the old games. But it's actually a lot closer than I thought. That coupled with the fact that the routes are shorter in Oras means that Oras still wins, but just barely. That coupled with the fact that the newer games have auto repel, meaning if a repel wears out, it'll automatically ask you if you want to use a repel again instead of having to reopen the menu and then use repels again like in the original. And the fact that they have decreased encounter rates in the newer games, meaning you can cover more land without running into wild Pokemon. That on top of like swimmer trainers, which are interdispersed around here. You know, swimmer trainers will always have water type Pokemon, so that's even less variety. All of this points to Game Freak making improvements here. The claim by IGN is still that even with all of these changes, it's still tedious and boring to navigate, which is why personally I think it's probably the weakest argument of the original article, since there were objectively designed choices made by Game Freak to improve this part of the experience. So you gotta give them props there. But if you still found the water routes tedious even after all the changes, I can't really blame you. It's a more subjective opinion. All of that being said, do Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire have too much water? Was it worth docking 2.2 points from these games like we saw here? If you ask me, it's going to be hard for a remake to ever pass the score of the original because it's just not going to be as groundbreaking as the original. But as much as people loved and continue to love these games, I don't think any of that justifies the backlash that IGN still continues to get. And if you're interested, you could have a look at the trainer data itself, which is all available if you join the Discord in the description. And if you want to see more data presentations to put to rest tired arguments like Pokemon levels, curves, I love to argue. You know, I'm always one for an argument, but let's have smarter arguments is sort of my whole pitch.